Imagine working your entire life building something from nothing, only to have your own family treat you like an ATM. My sister thought my success was her personal bank account. My parents? They backed her up. And when I said no, they gave me an ultimatum. Buy my sister a house, or lose my family forever. But here's where it gets crazy. Months later, the same people who kicked me out of their lives were begging me to save them. What happened next will shock you. My name's Sarah, and I grew up in what most people would call a typical middle-class family. My mom, Karen, worked as an accountant at a local firm, and my dad, Jim, was a project manager for a construction company. Then there was my sister, Emma, 3 years younger than me. Sarah, you need to set a better example for your sister. My mom would say almost every day. You're the oldest, you should know better. That phrase was practically a mantra in my house. Whether it was keeping my room tidy, acing my classes, or just behaving in general, the expectations were always higher for me. One evening when I was 16, and Emma was 13, we were both sitting at the dining room table, working on homework. I had my calculus textbook open, deep in solving equations, while Emma was doodling flowers in her notebook. Supposedly, she was brainstorming ideas for an English essay. "Mom," Emma called out, her voice full of exaggerated frustration. "This essay is so hard. I don't feel like doing it." Mom walked in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Oh, sweetie," she cooed. "It's okay. You're trying your best. Maybe tomorrow you'll feel more inspired." I remember rolling my eyes so hard I thought they might stay that way. Just last week, I'd been drowning in a history project and had asked for help. The response: "Sarah, you know you have to push through. If you want to get into a good school, you can't slack off." Mom noticed my reaction this time. "Is something funny, Sarah?" she asked, her tone sharp. "No," I replied, trying to sound neutral. "Just solved a tricky problem." "Well, focus on your work," she said briskly. "You know you need to keep your grades up if you want to get into a good college." That was another thing. My dream had always been to attend Stanford. Their computer science program was legendary, and I'd been working my tail off to maintain a perfect GPA, join every relevant extracurricular, and even start a coding club at school. When I brought it up junior year, my parents shut the idea down immediately. "Sarah, be realistic," my dad said over dinner. "Private schools are expensive. We need to save money for Emma's education too. You can get into a state school with a scholarship." I stared at the Stanford brochure later that night, trying to tamp down the disappointment. My best friend Jess came over and found me sitting cross-legged on my bed, surrounded by college materials. "They shut it down, huh?" she asked, flopping onto my comforter. "Yeah," I sighed. "Apparently, I need to be realistic and save the college fund for Emma." Jess gave me a sympathetic look. "That sucks, but you're the smartest person I know. You'll crush it wherever you go." "Thanks," I said with a weak smile. "If they want me to go to a state school, fine. But I'm going to prove I can succeed on my own terms." When I finally started at the University of California, it wasn't the dream school I'd imagined, but it turned out to be exactly what I needed. I dove headfirst into my programming classes, often spending late nights in the computer lab, long after other students had packed up and gone home. By my senior year, I'd stumbled upon an idea I couldn't shake. I'd noticed how many people struggled with organizing their lives, managing daily tasks, tracking deadlines, and keeping up with routines. One late night, while finishing a group project, the concept for an app started forming in my head. I grabbed a notebook and began sketching out what would eventually become Task Wizard, a task management app designed to make life easier. I became obsessed. Between classes, on weekends, and even during holidays, I was coding, debugging, and refining my idea. While other students partied or hung out, I was in the zone working on what I knew could be something special. After graduation, I took a leap of faith. I had a few solid job offers, but I decided to bet on myself instead. I pitched Task Wizard to tech companies, hoping someone would see its potential. Most ignored me. Some politely declined. But then one day a tech giant reached out. I'll never forget sitting in their boardroom, surrounded by executives in suits worth more than my entire college wardrobe. They tested my app, asking questions while I tried to keep my nerves in check. "This is impressive work," the CEO said, leaning forward with a smile. "Very impressive." The negotiations were intense, but when it was all said and done, I walked away with a check for $4. 8 million. I remember staring at my bank account, my hands trembling. It felt surreal. The first thing I did was buy a modest but beautiful apartment in a quiet neighborhood. The second thing, I launched my own app development company. The rest of the money went into savings and investments. I wasn't about to blow this opportunity. When I told my family about the deal, their reactions were interesting. 4.8 million? Mom had to sit down. Wow, Sarah, Dad said, shaking his head, looking both proud and overwhelmed. Emma? She stared at me with a look I couldn't quite place. Envy? Whatever it was, things shifted after that. I was no longer just Sarah, the responsible older sister. I was Sarah the millionaire. 2 years after I sold the app, Emma dropped her own big news. I'm getting married, she announced at Sunday dinner, holding up her hand to show off the diamond ring. Her fiancé Luke was sitting beside her, grinning like he just won the lottery. Tom proposed last weekend, she added, her voice practically bubbling over with excitement. I was genuinely happy for her. Luke seemed like a great guy and Emma deserved to be happy. Without hesitation, I offered her $15,000 as a wedding gift. Mom cleared her throat. You know, Sarah, weddings are very expensive these days. I paused, confused. 15,000 is a lot, Mom. Well, Emma chimed in, her voice taking on that sweet but manipulative tone I recognized all too well. It's nothing to you now. And this is my only wedding. Don't you want your little sister to have her dream honeymoon too? She went on to describe some luxury resort in the Maldives, complete with private overwater villas and butlers. After some guilt-tripping and a lot of back and forth, I reluctantly agreed to pay for the honeymoon on top of the wedding gift. I convinced myself it was fine. This was a once-in-a-lifetime thing for her after all. But after the wedding, I noticed a pattern emerging. At first, the comments from my family were subtle, wrapped in jokes or offhand remarks. But over time they grew bolder. For Mom's birthday, I bought her a designer handbag. She smiled and said, "Oh, this is lovely, Sarah. But, you know, I saw a much prettier one in the window of that boutique downtown." For Dad, I paid $1,200 to cover a car repair. He chuckled and said, "For a millionaire, you're awfully tight with your wallet. You could have thrown in an extra grand for new tires." Each time I gave something, it felt like it wasn't enough. No matter what I did, I was being measured not by my effort or intentions, but by the size of my bank account. And then there was Emma. She and Luke had been back from their dream honeymoon for 3 months and were still living at home with my parents. I thought it was temporary at first, but when I asked about it one day, Emma shrugged. "Have you seen rental prices lately? It's ridiculous," she said, rolling her eyes. "Why waste money on rent when we can save by staying here?" "You both have good jobs, Emma," I said, gesturing to the shopping bags from high-end boutiques scattered around her room. "You could easily afford a small apartment if you cut back on some of this." She huffed, flopping onto her bed. "Not everyone can just buy a place outright, Sarah. Some of us have to be practical." The irony of her calling herself practical while surrounded by designer clothes wasn't lost on me. Mom had started dropping hints too. Every family dinner seemed to include a comment about the housing market. "Did you see that little house down the street?" she'd say, shaking her head. "It sold for $500,000. It's criminal what they're charging these days. Young couples don't stand a chance." She'd always emphasize young couples, with a pointed look at Emma and Luke. One Sunday afternoon, I stopped by my parents' house unannounced. The scene I walked into felt strange. Mom, Dad, Emma, and Luke were huddled around the dining table, papers spread out in front of them. They scrambled to hide everything when they saw me. "What's going on?" I asked. "Nothing," Mom said quickly, her voice a little too cheerful. "Just looking at some things." Before she could tuck the papers away, I caught glimpses of house listings and mortgage rates. It didn't take a genius to figure out what they were planning, but I didn't push. If they were looking for a house, that was their business. 2 weeks later, Mom called me. "Sarah, we need to have an important family discussion," she said. "Can you come over tomorrow evening?" I assumed it was about something mundane like the refrigerator Mom had been complaining about. So I showed up the next night, ready to hear about broken ice makers or strange noises. Instead, I walked into an ambush. Mom, Dad, Emma, and Luke were all seated in the living room, looking strangely formal. They'd even left an empty seat in the middle of the circle, clearly meant for me. Sarah, Emma began, her tone serious, we've been having some family discussions. I nodded, waiting. Luke and I have decided it's time for us to have our own home, she said. That's great, I replied, genuinely pleased. That's definitely the right move. Emma exchanged glances with Mom and Dad before continuing. Well, since you're so successful now and you have more money than you know what to do with, we've decided that you should buy us a house. For a moment I thought I'd misheard. I'm sorry, what? It makes perfect sense, Emma said, gaining confidence. You have your own place. You bought it outright. Meanwhile, we're still living with Mom and Dad. It's not fair. I looked around the room waiting for someone to laugh, to tell me it was all a joke. But their faces were serious. Let me get this straight, I said slowly. You want me to buy you a house? Yes, Emma said, as if it were the most reasonable request in the world. You're my sister. You have millions. Why wouldn't you help me? I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. If you need help with the down payment, I'm happy to give you an interest-free loan. We can set it up through my lawyer. Emma leapt to her feet, her face turning red. A loan? Are you kidding me? You're just jealous because I'm happily married and you're alone with your precious money. The accusation felt like a slap. Jealous? I snapped. I gave you $15,000 for your wedding and paid for your Maldives honeymoon. That money could have covered my living expenses for a year. Oh, here we go, Emma sneered. Poor Sarah, always counting pennies despite her millions. You're pathetic. I stood up, my temper rising. I've worked for everything I have. I built my company from nothing. I live within my means and invest in my business. I have employees who depend on me, obligations. Obligations to everyone except your family. Mom cut in, her face a mask of disappointment. I'm ashamed of you, Sarah. How can you be so stingy? Stingy? I laughed bitterly. I've given Emma more money in the past few months than most people make in a year. And yet you live in a nice apartment while your sister has to live with her parents, Dad added. What kind of sister are you? Emma smoothed her dress. A designer piece I'd given her for her birthday. Here's how this is going to work, she said. Either you buy us a house, a nice house, not some cheap starter home, or you're no longer part of this family. It's your choice. Mom and Dad nodded in agreement. Luke sat silently, looking uncomfortable but not speaking up. I looked at each of them, my stomach twisting. These were the people who had raised me, the sister I'd grown up with. And now they were trying to extort me. Without another word, I picked up my purse and walked to the door. Sarah, Mom called after me. Don't you dare walk out that door. I paused, my hand on the doorknob. Walking out meant losing my family. Staying meant losing my self-respect. I opened the door and left, their angry voices following me down the driveway. The fallout began almost immediately. My phone buzzed nonstop with calls and texts from Mom and Emma. I ignored them at first, but after a sleepless night, I finally gave in and skimmed through some of the messages. How dare you walk out on your family like that? One text from Mom read. You've forgotten everything we've done for you, said another. That last part made me snap. I called Mom, my voice shaking with anger. Everything you've done for me? I asked as soon as she picked up. Like what exactly? We raised you, Sarah. Mom shouted. We put food on the table, clothes on your back. That's called being a parent, Mom. It's the bare minimum, I interrupted. Everything else, my education, my success, my company, I built that on my own. While you were saving money for Emma's college fund, I was working 3 part-time jobs just to scrape by in a tiny apartment with roommates. So don't you dare act like you handed me anything. Mom sputtered, but I didn't wait for a response. I hung up, my hands trembling, and blocked her number. The family drama hit its peak at Aunt Linda's birthday party the following weekend. I almost didn't go, but Aunt Linda had always been kind to me, and I didn't want to miss her special day because of all this nonsense. When I arrived, I kept my distance from my parents and Emma. I stuck to Aunt Linda and my cousins, hoping for a peaceful evening. But of course Mom couldn't let that happen. When it was time for toasts, Aunt Linda's friends had just finished saying sweet things about her when Mom stood up, wine glass in hand. Her cheeks were flushed, and I could tell she'd already had a few too many drinks. I'd like to say something, she announced, swaying slightly. About ungrateful children who forget where they came from. The room went silent. Aunt Linda looked horrified. My daughter Sarah, Mom continued, her voice sharp with bitterness, sits here in her fancy clothes with her millions in the bank, while her own sister is struggling to get a house. She refuses to help her family. She's become selfish and greedy. I froze, heat rising to my face as the room collectively gasped. That's enough, Karen, Aunt Linda said, standing up. This is not the time or place. But Mom wasn't done. She owes everything to us, she slurred. And now she won't even buy her sister a decent home. My cousin Rachel, sitting beside me, leaned over and whispered, Oh my God, is she serious? Emma, of course, jumped in. She made us get a lawyer contract just to consider helping with a down payment, she said, her voice shrill. Her own sister. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. I gave you $15,000 for your wedding, I said, my voice shaking with anger. And I paid for your Maldives honeymoon. Now you're demanding I buy you a house. The room was silent, forks frozen halfway to mouths as years of family dysfunction played out in real time. Aunt Linda cleared her throat. Sarah has been more than generous, she said firmly. She helped pay for Tommy's diabetes treatment last year and bought Sarah's college textbooks. She's always supported this family. Other relatives chimed in. Cousin Mike mentioned how I'd helped with his car repair. Aunt Sarah brought up the time I'd covered her emergency dental surgery. With each example, Mom's face grew redder. So, she helps everyone but her own sister? Emma shrieked. Unbelievable. I walked over to Aunt Linda, hugged her tightly and whispered, I'm so sorry for ruining your party. Happy birthday. Then I left, my heart pounding as I walked out the door. Later, I learned the party essentially ended after I left. Guests made quick excuses to leave, and the entire night dissolved into chaos. 2 days after the birthday party, I got a Facebook notification. My cousin Rachel had tagged me in a comment. Sarah, you need to see this, she wrote. I clicked through to Mom's page and my stomach dropped. With heavy hearts, Jim and I are officially disowning our eldest daughter, Sarah. Her selfishness and ingratitude have shown us that she cares more about money than family. From this day forward, we have only one daughter, our beloved Emma. The post had dozens of comments, mostly from family friends expressing shock and confusion. I sat there staring at my phone, feeling oddly calm. They'd finally done it, turned their emotional manipulation into a public spectacle. Without hesitation, I blocked them all. Mom, Dad, Emma, even Luke. Phone numbers, social media, emails gone. It felt like ripping off a bandage. Painful but necessary. For the first time in my life, there was silence. No guilt-tripping phone calls. No passive-aggressive comments. No demands. I threw myself into my work and started therapy, finally unpacking years of emotional baggage. But then 2 months later, Aunt Linda called. Sarah, your mom's been trying to reach you, she said, her voice tinged with concern. She says it's urgent. She seems desperate. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I answered reluctantly, already knowing who it was. Sarah. Mom's voice cracked with tears. Please don't hang up. I stayed silent, waiting. Everything's falling apart, she continued. We're going to lose the house. The loan we took out for Emma's wedding, we used the house as collateral. We can't make the payments anymore. My grip tightened on the phone as she kept talking. Your father lost his job. We're barely getting by. Please, Sarah, we need help. You're our only hope. I let out a bitter laugh. Your only hope? I repeated. I thought you only had one daughter now. You forced our hand, she snapped. If you just helped your sister. I'm a stranger to you now, remember? I interrupted. Strangers don't get to demand money from me. Her voice turned nasty. How dare you talk to your own mother like this? Have you no shame? A wave of calm washed over me. You disowned me over money, I said evenly. A real mother doesn't manipulate or shame her daughter into submission. You made your choice. Now live with it. I hung up before she could respond. A few months after Mom's desperate phone call, I had brunch with Aunt Linda. Over coffee, she let slip something that stopped me in my tracks. Your dad didn't lose his job, she said, stirring her drink casually. I frowned. What do you mean? He switched to part-time because he wanted a better work-life balance, she explained, her voice laced with frustration. And about the house? There's no bank threatening to take it. They made all that up to guilt you into giving them money. For a moment I just sat there, stunned. I should have felt furious, but oddly I didn't. Their manipulation was so blatant, so transparent, that it somehow made everything clear. I took a deep breath and nodded. Thank you for telling me, Aunt Linda. I guess it's nice to have confirmation of what I already suspected. She reached across the table and gave my hand a squeeze. You're better off without their nonsense, Sarah. They've been bad-mouthing you at every family gathering, but honestly, most of us are sick of hearing it. Nobody invites them anymore because all they do is complain. That last part surprised me. Really? Aunt Linda laughed. Oh yes. Everyone's tired of their pity party. Emma goes on and on about her selfish millionaire sister who abandoned her family, but most people know better. You've helped so many of us. You don't owe them anything. Hearing that was oddly freeing. For years I'd carried the weight of their expectations, their guilt trips, their endless demands. But now I realized something. The problem wasn't me. It was them. That conversation with Aunt Linda was a turning point. For so long I've been trying to prove myself to my family, hoping to earn their love and approval. But now I understood that their love came with conditions, and I wasn't willing to pay the price anymore. I decided it was time for a change. That night I called Sophie, my old college roommate who now worked as a personal stylist. I need a transformation, I told her. Over the next few months, Sophie helped me revamp my wardrobe, trading my practical programmer clothes for stylish pieces that made me feel confident and empowered. I started seeing a cosmetologist who helped me develop a skincare routine that gave me a glow I hadn't seen in years. I even chopped off my long, no-nonsense hair, opting for a shorter, edgier style that felt more like me. But the changes weren't just external. I started saying yes to things I'd always been too cautious to try. When my friend Jessica suggested a spontaneous weekend trip to Paris, I went. When my coding buddy Mark invited me to join his rock climbing group, I gave it a shot. Even though I was terrified of heights, I expanded my social circle, joining a women's entrepreneurship network and a book club. I also started mentoring young programmers, especially girls who reminded me of myself when I was younger. Meanwhile, my company continued to thrive. I hired more staff, launched new apps, and found myself surrounded by people who valued me for who I was, not what I could give them. 1 year after Mom's infamous Facebook post, I received an invitation to my cousin Tommy's wedding. My parents and Emma would be there, but for the first time the thought didn't fill me with dread. When the day came, I walked into the venue with my head held high. I wore a sleek black dress that Sophie had picked out for me, paired with heels that made me feel unstoppable. My parents and Emma were seated at a table near the front, but I didn't approach them. Instead, I spent the evening catching up with relatives who were genuinely happy to see me. At one point, Cousin Rachel pulled me aside. "They've been glaring at you all night," she whispered with a grin. I glanced over at their table. Sure enough, Mom, Dad, and Emma were watching me like hawks. "Let them glare," I said with a shrug. "I'm done bending over backward to make them happy." Rachel laughed. "Good for you, Sarah. You deserve better." A few days after the wedding, I was cleaning out some old boxes when I stumbled upon a photo from my college graduation. In the picture, I was standing on the stage, clutching my diploma with a nervous smile. I barely recognized the girl in the photo. She looked so eager to please, so desperate for approval, so afraid of standing up for herself. I framed the photo and put it on my desk, not as a reminder of what I'd lost, but of what I'd gained. Sometimes walking away isn't an ending, it's a beginning. Sometimes the family you're born into isn't the family you're meant to keep. And sometimes the greatest act of self-love is saying no to the people who treat your boundaries like suggestions and your love like an ATM.